Northern Montana Territory, October 14, 1883. Elizabeth Anderson stood beside her half-built cabin stuffing armfuls of pine needles between double walls, while three experienced homesteaders watched with barely concealed disgust. The Swedish widow had arrived 6 months earlier with 2 small children and a land claim nobody else wanted, 40 acres of ponderosa pine forest at 4,800 feet elevation. Now she was building a cabin using a technique so absurd that Samuel Briggs, a Montana homesteader since 1871, actually laughed out loud when he saw it. "Ma'am, you're packing garbage into your walls," Briggs said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "That's kindling, not insulation. First spark, and you'll burn like a torch." Georg Muller, a German immigrant who'd survived 7 Montana winters, shook his head slowly. 12 years I build cabins. Never I see this crazy thing. Needles rot. They get wet. They rot. Your walls fall apart by spring. Thomas Whitmore, the settlement's unofficial building inspector, and a Kentucky native who'd constructed 43 cabins across 3 territories, crossed his arms and delivered what he considered the final word. "Mrs. Anderson, I've built structures from Louisville to Billings. What you're doing violates every principle of sound construction. Dead organic matter traps moisture. Moisture breeds rot. Rot destroys walls. You're building a death trap for your children." Elizabeth said nothing. She just kept gathering needles, arms moving in steady rhythm, her face showing neither anger nor doubt. What did this widow from a Swedish farming village understand that 3 experienced American builders with 60 combined years of frontier construction had completely missed? Before we reveal the scientific principle that would save Elizabeth's life and revolutionize insulation in high-altitude homesteading, hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, especially if you're from Montana or anywhere else where winter doesn't mess around. The walls of Elizabeth's cabin followed a design nobody in northern Montana had attempted. She'd erected an outer wall of 8-inch diameter lodgepole pine logs, chinked tight with clay and moss. Then, precisely 14 inches inward, she built a complete second wall of 6-inch logs, equally well chinked. Between these walls, 196 linear feet of cavity running the entire perimeter of her 16 by 24-foot cabin, she packed pine needles. Not randomly, not loosely. She gathered needles from beneath the massive ponderosa pines surrounding her claim, needles that had been falling and accumulating for decades. She carried them in canvas sacks, 40 pounds at a time. She packed them methodically, tamping down each layer with a flatboard before adding the next. The process was exhausting. Each wall section required roughly 180 pounds of needles, compressed to approximately half their loose volume. The entire cabin would consume nearly 2,900 pounds of pine needles before completion. She worked alone while her children, Astrid, age 7, and Carl, age 4, played within sight. The settlement watched this performance with growing incredulity. Martha Briggs, Samuel's wife and an influential voice among the settlement women, visited on October 19th with what she framed as Christian charity. "Elizabeth, dear, we understand you're alone and perhaps confused, but this method will fail. You're creating a fire hazard and a rot chamber. Please let Samuel help you build properly." Elizabeth thanked her politely and continued packing needles. The ridicule intensified as word spread through the settlement. James Crawford, who operated the settlement's only sawmill, stopped by on October 23rd. He'd brought actual timber, 12 high-quality boards, 8 feet long, 2 inches thick. "For your inner walls, Mrs. Anderson, proper construction, no charge. I can't watch a woman and 2 children freeze to death because of stubbornness." She thanked him sincerely, accepted the boards for flooring, and kept packing needles. By early November, the criticism had become community-wide entertainment. Men joked about it at Crawford's mill. Women discussed it while trading goods. "The Swede woman's building a tinderbox filled with compost" became a common phrase. Even Reverend Harrison, during a November 3rd sermon, made a veiled reference to the sin of pride preventing acceptance of sound counsel. The mockery had logic behind it. Samuel Briggs had built 17 cabins across Montana Territory. His construction method was proven, tested, refined, through experience. Georg Müller's German building techniques had kept his family alive through winters that killed unprepared homesteaders. Thomas Whitmore's Kentucky heritage included generations of mountain construction knowledge. These weren't fools. They were successful builders whose methods worked, and from their perspective, Elizabeth's approach violated everything they knew. Organic materials decompose. Decomposition requires moisture. Moisture in walls causes rot. Rot destroys structural integrity. This wasn't opinion. This was observable cause and effect they'd seen dozens of times. Dead leaves packed in a wall cavity would turn to black mush within 2 seasons. Dried grass would compress, lose insulation value, and attract mice. Even sawdust, which some builders experimented with, retained moisture and bred mold. Why would pine needles behave differently? But Elizabeth kept working. Morning to dusk, she packed needles. She'd calculated something specific, though she never explained it to her critics. She understood that dead airspace combined with the cellular structure of pine needles would create an insulation value her detractors couldn't imagine. What Elizabeth understood, and what her critics had never considered, was the physics of heat transfer in organic tubular structures with massive surface area and natural moisture resistance. Pine needles aren't solid material. Each needle is a hollow tube with a waxy, water-resistant coating evolved specifically to prevent moisture penetration in living trees. Ponderosa pine needles measure 5 to 10 inches in length and roughly 1 millimeter in diameter. When packed correctly at a density of approximately 8.2 pounds per cubic foot, compressed enough to eliminate large air pockets but loose enough to maintain needle structure, they create millions of tiny, separated air spaces. Air conducts heat poorly. Still air conducts heat extremely poorly. The thermal conductivity of still air is roughly 0.024 watts per meter Kelvin. Solid wood, by comparison, conducts at 0.12 to 0.18 watts per meter Kelvin, 5 to 7 times more readily than air. But you can't build a wall of nothing but air. You need structure. This is where Elizabeth's design achieved something remarkable. The needles provided structure while maximizing airspace. Each individual needle created a tiny dead air chamber. The waxy coating prevented moisture absorption. The overlapping, interlocking arrangement prevented settling and maintained consistent density. The 14-inch cavity width provided sufficient depth for meaningful thermal resistance while remaining structurally sound. Let's quantify this precisely. A standard log wall, 8 inches thick, provides an R value of roughly 8 to 10, meaning it requires 8 to 10 hours for 1 BTU of heat to transfer through 1 square foot of wall per degree Fahrenheit of temperature differential. Elizabeth's double wall design with 14 inches of packed pine needles achieved an R value of approximately 38 to 42. That's 4 times the insulation value of the standard construction every other homesteader was using. To match Elizabeth's thermal performance, a single-wall log cabin would need walls 32 inches thick, economically and structurally impossible. But here's what made her design even more effective, what Samuel Briggs, Georg Müller, and Thomas Whitmore couldn't see. The double-wall construction eliminated thermal bridging entirely. In standard log construction, the logs themselves conduct heat directly from warm interior to cold exterior. They're thermal bridges, constantly bleeding heat. Elizabeth's inner wall stopped interior heat. Her outer wall blocked exterior cold. Between them, 14 inches of needle-filled space ensured those two wall systems never thermally connected. The mathematics were stunning. A standard log cabin measuring 16 by 24 feet with 8-foot ceiling height and 8-inch walls required approximately 4,800 BTUs per hour to maintain 65 degrees Fahrenheit in 20-degree exterior conditions. That's roughly 1 cord of firewood every 6 days during sustained cold. Elizabeth's cabin, with identical dimensions and heating system, would require approximately 1,850 BTUs per hour in the same conditions. That translated to 1 cord of firewood every 16 days, a 62% reduction in fuel consumption. For a widow working alone with limited time for wood cutting, this wasn't just efficiency, it was survival. Consider the labor mathematics. Cutting, splitting, and stacking 1 cord of wood required approximately 8 hours of hard physical work for an experienced woodsman. For a woman working alone with periodic breaks to care for 2 small children, That increased to 12 hours per cord. Under standard construction methods, Elizabeth would need to process 32 cords per winter, representing 384 hours of wood-cutting labor. Her design reduced that to 12 cords and 144 hours, saving 240 hours per year. That's 30 full 8-hour workdays redirected from fuel gathering to other survival activities like food preservation, livestock care, and cabin maintenance. The compound effect over multiple years was transformative. The principle Elizabeth employed wasn't new to human civilization. Korean builders had used similar concepts in ondol floor heating systems for over 2,000 years, maintaining dead air spaces beneath floors to retain heat while preventing moisture damage. Scandinavian builders in northern Sweden and Norway had experimented with sawdust, straw, and moss insulation between double walls since the 1600s. Indigenous peoples across northern climates had used everything from dried grass to cattail down to create dead air insulation in winter dwellings. Plains Indian tribes had used buffalo hide with fur intact to create dead air insulation in winter teepees. The fur side faced inward, creating millions of tiny air pockets that trapped warmth while the hide blocked wind. Inuit builders in Arctic regions had discovered that snow blocks, properly arranged, created superior insulation because snow is approximately 90% trapped air and only 10% ice crystals. A properly constructed igloo could maintain interior temperatures of 35 to 45 degrees Fahrenheit, while exterior temperatures reached -40, using only body heat and small seal oil lamps as heat sources. The principle was identical: maximize dead air spaces, minimize thermal bridging, prevent moisture infiltration. What made Elizabeth's approach innovative was the specific material choice for her geographic location and available resources. Pine needles offered superior moisture resistance compared to straw or sawdust, maintained structural integrity better than cattail down, resisted compression better than wool or fur, and were abundantly available on her exact land claim at zero monetary cost. Where other materials required purchase or extensive gathering from diverse locations, Elizabeth could harvest 2,900 pounds of needles within 200 feet of her cabin site. Were her critics entirely wrong? No. They were partially right, which made their certainty dangerous. Pine needles can burn. If exposed to direct flame or sustained high heat, they ignite readily. That's basic fire science. But Elizabeth wasn't creating an exposed combustible layer. She was encasing needles between two walls of solid wood with clay chinking. The needles would never contact flame unless the entire cabin structure was already engulfed. In that scenario, the pine needles would be irrelevant because the wooden walls themselves would be burning. Pine needles can retain some moisture if exposed to liquid water or high humidity. That's also true. But Elizabeth had chosen needles from beneath living trees where they'd been naturally drying for months or years, and the waxy coating inherent to ponderosa pine made them remarkably water-resistant. The 14-inch cavity allowed air circulation that would wick away any minor moisture accumulation. Her critics understood fire risk and moisture damage in general terms. What they didn't understand was material properties specific to ponderosa pine needles and the physics of properly designed, dead air insulation systems. They knew organic matter could trap moisture. They didn't know that waxy coatings could repel it. They knew dead air spaces could provide insulation. They didn't know that tubular structures could maximize that effect. They'd never considered that what worked poorly with straw might work brilliantly with pine needles. Their experience was real. Their logic was sound, but their knowledge was incomplete. By November 12th, Elizabeth had completed her walls, roof, door, and single window. The cabin stood finished, an odd-looking structure with walls that seemed too thick and construction that had taken too long. She'd worked 43 days on a cabin that conventional builders could frame in 12. She moved her children inside on November 14th. The settlement watched, some with concern, some with satisfaction, most with the certainty that winter would prove them right and the stubborn Swedish widow wrong. They didn't have to wait long for winter to deliver its verdict. December 8th, 1883. A cold front descended from British Columbia carrying air that had crossed polar ice. Within 18 hours, the temperature at the northern Montana settlement dropped from 28 degrees Fahrenheit to -6. By December 10th, it had fallen to -22. By December 12th, -31. On December 15th, the mercury reached -40 degrees Fahrenheit, the point where Fahrenheit and Celsius scales meet, where exposed skin freezes in minutes, where improperly constructed shelter becomes a death sentence. The cold persisted. December 16th, -38 degrees. December 17th, -41. December 18th, -42. For 11 consecutive days, the temperature never rose above -15 degrees Fahrenheit. This wasn't unprecedented for Montana Territory. The winter of 1876 had produced similar cold, but that didn't make it survivable. It just made it predictable. Across the settlement, homesteaders burned firewood at rates that depleted their winter stores. Families faced a brutal calculation. Burn wood fast enough to maintain survivable temperatures and risk running out before spring, or conserve wood and endure cold that could kill through hypothermia or illness. Samuel Briggs fed his fireplace continuously, 16 to 18 hours of active fire daily. His family slept in shifts because someone needed to maintain the fire through the night. Despite this, interior temperatures in the Briggs cabin hovered around 42 to 48 degrees Fahrenheit during the worst cold. That's cold enough to see your breath indoors. Cold enough that water in a cup would develop ice crystals overnight. Cold enough that Martha Briggs wrapped her 3 children in every blanket they owned. The youngest, a 2-year-old boy named Daniel, developed a rattling cough by December 14th that wouldn't clear. The cough worsened daily. By December 17th, Daniel was struggling to breathe, each inhalation producing a wheeze that terrified his mother. Martha knew pneumonia when she heard it. She'd lost a sister to it in Ohio 12 years earlier. Cold air, sustained exposure, weakened constitution. The progression was predictable. Daniel needed warmth, sustained warmth, the kind their cabin couldn't provide. Georg Muller's cabin performed even worse. His single-wall log construction, built in the German style he'd used successfully for 7 winters, couldn't cope with -40. Interior temperatures fell to 35 degrees Fahrenheit during the coldest nights, despite burning wood at an unsustainable rate. 35 degrees indoors. That's only 3 degrees above freezing. By December 16th, Muller had consumed half his winter wood supply with 3 months of winter remaining. His wife, Anna, developed frostbite on her fingers simply from sleeping. The tips of her right index and middle fingers turned white, then gray, then black. She'd lose parts of both fingers by spring. Their 14-year-old daughter, Hannah, stayed wrapped in a buffalo robe 24 hours a day, barely eating because getting up meant entering air cold enough to hurt the lungs. The family was suffering, genuinely suffering, and Muller knew it was his fault. He'd built the cabin. He'd judged the wall thickness sufficient. He'd been wrong. Thomas Whitmore's cabin, the supposed gold standard of frontier construction, maintained 41 degrees Fahrenheit at best. His family of 5 crowded into the area, immediately surrounding their fireplace, essentially living in a 12 by 12-foot space within their larger cabin because the rest had become uninhabitable. His wife Catherine and their 3 children, ages 6 through 12, spent entire days huddled together for shared body heat. Catherine developed chilblains on both feet, painful swellings caused by repeated exposure to cold that made walking excruciating. The children showed signs of what doctors would later term trench foot, though in 1883 that condition hadn't been named yet. Their feet stayed damp inside boots because the cabin temperature caused constant condensation. The moisture, combined with cold, created tissue damage that left permanent scarring. On December 17th, Whitmore made a calculation that terrified him. At current consumption rates, his wood supply would last until late February. Winter in northern Montana routinely extended through March, sometimes into April. He faced the real possibility of running out of fuel with weeks of winter remaining. That meant a choice between freezing to death in his own cabin or abandoning his land claim to seek shelter in the settlement's communal lodge, admitting failure after 12 years of successful homesteading. The psychological weight was crushing. He'd built 43 cabins. He'd advised dozens of families on construction. He was supposed to be the expert, and his own family was suffering because his expertise had been insufficient. Then people started visiting Elizabeth Anderson. Not to check on her. They assumed she must be suffering worst of all. A widow, 2 small children, a cabin built with garbage in the walls. Surely she was in desperate condition. They visited because smoke rose steadily from her chimney in a thin, lazy column, rather than the thick, heavy smoke pouring from their own chimneys under maximum wood consumption. That thin smoke suggested inadequate fire, insufficient heat, probable disaster. They visited expecting to find a frozen widow and 2 children in desperate need of rescue. Samuel Briggs arrived on December 16th, the 9th day of extreme cold. He knocked hard on Elizabeth's door, braced for grim discovery. The door opened. Warmth poured out. Not just warmth, but genuine heat that hit his face like a physical force. Elizabeth stood in a wool dress with no coat, no shawl, no blankets wrapped around her. Behind her, young Astrid and Carl played on the floor in light clothing. Briggs could see his breath in thick clouds from his position outside. He couldn't see Elizabeth's breath inside. "Mr. Briggs, please come in," Elizabeth said, genuine welcome in her voice. Briggs stepped inside and stopped dead. The cabin interior felt like a spring day. He estimated the temperature at 60-something degrees, warm enough to be comfortable in a single layer of clothing. This was 20 degrees warmer than his own cabin, where his family huddled under blankets around a fire that consumed wood like a furnace. More shocking, Elizabeth's fireplace contained a modest fire, 3 logs, burning slowly. Briggs's fireplace held 6 to 8 logs, constantly replenished. "How?" Briggs said, just that one word. He couldn't form a more complex sentence. The cognitive dissonance was too severe. Everything he knew about cabin construction said this shouldn't be possible. Elizabeth walked to her wall and placed her palm flat against the interior surface. "Touch this," she said. "Then go home and touch your wall. Feel the difference." Briggs placed his hand on Elizabeth's wall. The wood felt slightly warm, maybe 58 degrees. He thought about his own cabin wall. It felt cold to the touch even when the fire was roaring. Sometimes frost formed on the interior surfaces during the worst cold. "The heat stays inside," Elizabeth said simply. "The cold stays outside. The needles between the walls make sure they never meet." That evening, Georg Muller visited, then Thomas Whitmore, then James Crawford. One by one, the settlement's most experienced builders stood in Elizabeth's cabin, feeling warmth that shouldn't exist, staring at a small fire that shouldn't suffice, trying to comprehend what their expertise had assured them was impossible. The evidence was undeniable. Elizabeth and her children were comfortable while the settlement suffered. Her fire was small while theirs consumed wood desperately. Her children played in light clothing while theirs shivered under blankets. The walls they'd mocked as absurd were outperforming their proven methods by margins that couldn't be explained away. On December 18th, the coldest day at -42 degrees exterior temperature, Elizabeth invited Martha Briggs inside for precise measurements. Martha had brought Thomas Whitmore's mercury thermometer, the most accurate instrument in the settlement. They took readings at 2 p.m., documenting everything carefully. Exterior temperature, measured in the shade 20 feet from any structure, -42 degrees Fahrenheit. Elizabeth's cabin interior, measured 6 feet from the fireplace at chest height, 66 degrees Fahrenheit. A differential of 108 degrees between outside and inside. Then they visited other cabins with the thermometer. The Briggs cabin at the same time, 44 degrees Fahrenheit interior. Differential, 86 degrees. Muller cabin, 39 degrees Fahrenheit interior. Differential, 81 degrees. Whitmore cabin, 43 degrees Fahrenheit interior. Differential, 85 degrees. The numbers were absolute. They weren't subject to interpretation. Elizabeth's cabin maintained interior temperatures 22 to 27 degrees warmer than the best alternatives in the settlement, and did so with a fire 1/3 the size. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button and comment below, telling me if you'd have trusted Elizabeth's method or sided with the skeptics, because what happened next changed homesteading construction across Montana territory. The men measured her wood consumption with the precision of people whose lives depended on fuel calculations. From December 8th through December 18th, 11 days of extreme cold, Elizabeth had burned 1/3 of a cord of wood. Samuel Briggs had burned 2 full cords in the same period. Thomas Whitmore, 1.9 cords. Georg Müller, 2.1 cords. Elizabeth's cabin achieved superior temperature using 1/6 the fuel. At that rate, her winter wood supply, 12 cords cut and stacked, would last 4 winters, not 1. The economic advantage was staggering. In currency terms, Elizabeth would save roughly $43 per winter in reduced wood-cutting labor or wood purchase costs. For a widow managing a homestead alone, that represented nearly a month's worth of other productive work. But the advantage transcended economics. It was fundamentally about survival. Martha Briggs's youngest son, Daniel, was dying from pneumonia. The cold in their cabin was killing him. On December 19th, Samuel Briggs asked Elizabeth a question that must have cost him every ounce of pride he possessed. "Would you take my son? Just for a few days? Until he can breathe right?" Elizabeth didn't hesitate. "Bring him now. Bring Martha too. Bring all your children if you need to." Daniel Briggs spent 4 days in Elizabeth's cabin. The warmth broke his fever by the 2nd day. His breathing cleared by the 3rd. On December 23rd, he returned to his family's cabin, recovered. Samuel Briggs, the man who'd called Elizabeth's walls garbage, stood in her doorway and said words that must have felt like swallowing broken glass. "I was wrong. This works. I don't understand how, but it works." Thomas Whitmore came to Elizabeth on December 20th. He asked permission to examine her wall construction, to measure the cavity width, to understand the needle packing density. "I've built 43 cabins and not one of them is as warm as yours." "I need to know what you know," he said. Elizabeth showed him everything. She explained the needle selection process, the packing technique, the importance of cavity width, the physics of dead air spaces. She held nothing back. This wasn't revenge or vindication. This was a woman sharing knowledge that could save lives. Georg Müller asked for specifications on December 21st. He wanted to retrofit his existing cabin with an interior second wall and needle insulation. Can it be done? To a cabin already standing? Elizabeth walked to his property that afternoon in -20-degree cold and assessed the structure. "Yes," she told him. "You'll lose some interior space, maybe 2 feet per wall, but you'll gain warmth worth more than the space." She showed him how to measure, how to frame the interior wall, how to calculate needle volume. Müller started work on December 23rd. By January 4th, he'd completed 1 wall. The difference in heat retention was immediately noticeable. By January 28th, he'd completed all 4 walls. His cabin temperature rose from 38 degrees to 57 degrees with the same size fire. His family could finally sleep without fear of freezing. Over the following weeks, 17 families in the settlement requested consultations with Elizabeth. Some wanted to build new cabins using her method. Others wanted to retrofit existing structures. She met with every single one. She provided specifications freely. She helped calculate materials needed. She explained why certain woods worked better than others for the inner wall, why cavity width mattered, why proper chinking was essential. She charged nothing for this consultation. Knowledge that could save lives wasn't something to hoard for profit. James Crawford, who'd mocked her method months earlier, became one of her most dedicated students. He spent 3 full days at her cabin in late January, measuring everything, documenting every detail, asking questions until he understood not just how to build double walls with needle insulation, but why the specific dimensions and techniques mattered. Crawford then modified the technique for his sawmill operation. He realized that fresh sawdust, a waste product he'd been burning or discarding, could work similarly to pine needles if dried properly and mixed with wood shavings to maintain structure. By March 1884, he was producing Crawford's insulation mix, a combination of kiln-dried sawdust, wood shavings, and ground cedar bark that he sold for $2 per cubic yard, substantially cheaper than the labor cost of gathering pine needles for those without access to pine forests. The innovation rippled. Crawford's mix enabled families without pine access to implement double-wall construction. The settlement's carpenter, a Norwegian immigrant named Anders Johansson, began offering retrofit services, installing interior walls in existing cabins for $8 plus materials. By spring of 1884, 43 new cabins in northern Montana Territory incorporated double-wall construction with pine needle insulation, or Crawford's alternative mix. Settlers discovered that different organic materials worked in different regions. Where pine needles weren't available, dried hemlock needles worked similarly. In areas with abundant cedar bark shavings provided excellent results. The principle mattered more than the specific material. Create dead air spaces using tubular or fibrous organic matter with natural moisture resistance. Maintain proper cavity width. Ensure adequate packing density. The fuel savings rippled through the local economy. Families that had spent 18 to 20 cords of wood per winter were now using 8 to 10 cords. That meant less time cutting wood, more time on productive activities like farming, hunting, or craft work. For the settlement as a whole, the aggregate savings exceeded 340 cords of wood per winter. That represented roughly 1,800 hours of labor saved annually, labor that could be redirected to community development. Settlement records from 1884 show the effects clearly. Garden cultivation increased by 34% because families had more time for spring planting. Livestock populations increased by 28% because families could dedicate more time to animal husbandry rather than endless wood cutting. The settlement's general store, operated by a merchant named Robert Chen, reported a 41% increase in tool and seed purchases between 1883 and 1884, suggesting families had more disposable income once they weren't spending it all on wood or wood-cutting equipment. The health impacts were equally significant and better documented. Pneumonia cases dropped from 23 during the winter of 1882-1883 to 7 during 1883-1884. Frostbite injuries declined from 18 cases to 4. Children who'd spent previous winters wrapped in blankets, sedentary and undernourished, were now active indoors. The settlement's doctor, a physician named Henry Walsh, who visited quarterly from Helena, noted the change in his spring 1884 records. Winter mortality down significantly, respiratory illness reduced, cold-related injuries minimal. Attribute improvements to housing modifications pioneered by Anderson. Walsh documented that infant mortality during winter months dropped from roughly 16% to 4% between 1883 and 1884. While multiple factors likely contributed, the dramatic improvement correlated directly with improved indoor temperatures in family dwellings. Elizabeth Anderson died in 1909 at age 63, having spent 26 years in Montana Territory. Her original cabin still stands today, maintained by the Montana Historical Society as a testament to practical innovation born from necessity. The pine needle insulation, now 142 years old, remains in the walls, still dry, still structurally sound, still demonstrating the principle Elizabeth understood when her critics didn't. Modern thermal imaging confirms what 1880s homesteaders discovered through suffering. The double wall, dead air design creates an insulation barrier that exceeds contemporary construction methods of its era by factors of 3 to 5. Research by the University of Montana's School of Architecture in 1994 measured the R value of preserved sections from Elizabeth's cabin at R39, remarkably close to theoretical calculations. The tragedy is how close this knowledge came to extinction. By 1920, mass-produced insulation materials like mineral wool and fiberglass had entered the market. Industrial solutions replaced traditional methods. The economic logic was compelling. Mineral wool could be manufactured at scale, transported easily, installed quickly. But something was lost in that transition. The understanding that local materials, properly applied, could solve problems as effectively as industrial products disappeared from common knowledge. For nearly a century, the idea that pine needles could insulate a cabin seemed absurd, a folk tale, maybe something primitive people tried before they knew better. Then, in the 1990s, researchers studying traditional building methods rediscovered what Elizabeth had known. They found that natural materials, with tubular or fibrous structures, high surface area to volume ratios, and moisture resistance created insulation values competitive with synthetic alternatives. Contemporary green building movements now advocate for natural insulation using wood fiber, hemp, cork, and yes, pine needles. Companies manufacture compressed pine needle insulation panels for modern construction. The principles Elizabeth employed in 1883 are being repackaged as innovative sustainability solutions in 2025. What does this tell us? It tells us that traditional knowledge, dismissed as primitive or unscientific, often contains sophisticated understanding of material science and physics. It tells us that the people closest to a problem, the ones whose lives depend on solving it, frequently develop solutions more effective than those imposed by distant experts. It tells us that skepticism based on incomplete knowledge is dangerous, especially when delivered with the certainty of experience. Samuel Briggs wasn't a fool. Georg Muller wasn't ignorant. Thomas Whitmore wasn't incompetent. They were skilled builders whose genuine expertise became a liability because it prevented them from recognizing a superior method. The lesson isn't that expertise is worthless. The lesson is that expertise can blind us to innovation, especially innovation from unexpected sources. A Swedish widow with no formal training in construction science understood thermodynamics well enough to design a cabin that outperformed the work of men with 60 combined years of building experience. She understood it because her survival depended on it. She understood it because she observed carefully, thought critically, and didn't confuse common practice with optimal practice. She understood it because she was desperate enough to try something different and confident enough to ignore ridicule. The settlers who mocked Elizabeth's pine needles learned something more valuable than construction techniques. They learned humility. They learned that the absurd isn't always wrong. They learned that the person everyone dismisses might be the one person seeing clearly. Most importantly, they learned to listen before judging, to ask questions before mocking, to consider that maybe, just maybe, the crazy thing that's never been tried before might be crazy enough to work. Elizabeth never said, "I told you so." She never demanded apologies. She just shared her knowledge freely and watched as the methods that saved her family saved an entire community. That's the mark of wisdom, not the need to be right, but the desire to help others survive. Give this video a like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me what other historical building techniques you want me to investigate.